If you want a comprehensive series of in-depth astrology information in an audiobook format, check out the 4-part Elements series by Stephen Forrest. I had the privilege of narrating it to audiobook, and it's a must for any astrology library. His complete life's work in a 4-volume set. The Book of Fire, Earth, Air, and Water. Direct links to all 4 books are on hightimelinebooks.com or available on Audible and Apple Books. Welcome to the Old Soul, New Soul Astrology Podcast. Thomas Miller and Robert Glasscock back with a sequel to the previous episode that we released about the question, can you see future life incarnations, or what the theme of a future life might be from a natal birth chart? And Robert's answer from my chart and his own blew us away, truly. Well, I had somebody send me a chart in Placidus, that house system, that said, there are no planets in my 5th house. What do I do? And she has, I think, 4 kids. Well, she did have planets in the 5th house when you put it in the equal house system, which is what Robert uses. And I wanted to just run this by you, Robert, and ask, is this specifically an equal house technique, or is this something that could work with other house systems?
Well, it's a great question. And we have talked about these house systems in past podcasts, very early on, if you go back a couple of years, and why I use equal houses. But I encourage everybody to try all the house systems. I did. But equal houses by far works, quote unquote, for me better than any other house system. And I learned that from Linda Goodman, whose teacher Lloyd Cope in New York got her onto equal houses. So I haven't used anything but. This question about, my 5th house is empty. We all have empty houses. Does that mean that those house matters are nothing? Of course not. So if you have an empty house, 5th house, let's say, which does rule your next incarnation, the 5th house is the projection of self into the future, which, as we've talked about, can be children, biological children, or creative children, figurative children, or the next life. If it's empty, it doesn't mean you don't have a future life. You take the sign on the 5th cusp and look at the planetary ruler of that sign on the 5th, because that planet will rule your next life. And you study that planet and its aspects in your chart. And you can turn the wheel if you want to, so that the 5th house of the future life is on the 1st cusp, and then read the planetary placements. And you can get a big picture of what you are building toward. Just like if you take the 9th house of your past life, it may be empty too, but that doesn't mean you didn't have a past life. If you turn that empty 9th house to be on the 1st cusp, you take the planet that rules that sign, and it becomes the chart ruler of your past life. And read the chart with those rearranged houses, just like you would a present life. So she does have a future. And no planets in the 5th house doesn't mean that she doesn't have one.
Okay, perfect.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And perfect setup for this. Great review of what we disclosed and taught in the last episode. And something hit me and it hit you as we were reviewing this, and we wanted to address it here. And this is really probably the primary question. Then I have one more after this. So what we're saying is, in my natal chart, and we'll put it back up so we can reference it. In my natal chart, the 5th house, which is ruled by Libra and has 3 planets in it, Mars, Neptune, and the Sun, represents, among other things, my children in this life. And then, as Robert just said, you go to the 9th house, and that was the past theme, and he brilliantly read that in the previous episode with Aquarius on the cusp, and no planets, midheaven's in there, but no planets. And then we were saying that if you wanted to see your children's future life, you could look at that same 9th house and those themes, and he described all of that. So I was thinking, wait a minute, This is almost like woo doo 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 doo. So what we're saying is that my past is their future. And when I brought it up to Robert, he said, well, yeah, and. So why don't you fill us in on how you can deal with that of the separation that, no, they're not destined to relive their parents' past life?
Great question, and it's a great way to think. The children, so you have two children. Children in general as a collective, so both of your children as a separate entity are ruled by your fifth house, but your first child, your oldest child, is very specifically ruled by the fifth house. In a male's chart, his first child is ruled by his fifth. His second child, who is a sibling of the first child, is ruled by the third from the fifth. So your first child is ruled by your fifth. Your second child is ruled by your seventh. So now you get to this point of your first child's future life. Yes, it's the fifth from the fifth, but we've already used that house to look at your past life. Now, we can do it again if you want, but you learn this technique from horary astrology. If you land on a house that has already been used in the question, you go to the next house. So since we had already used the ninth house to look at your past life, and now down the road it comes up, well, let's look at my children, and let's look at my children's future life. Well, yes, technically, that is their fifth from the fifth of children. But specifically, the ninth house is the fifth from your first child. And since we've already used it, we now have justification to move to the next house, which in this case is ruled by Pisces and the planets Jupiter and Neptune, to read your first child's future life. See what I mean?
Yes, and then just go ahead for explanation. That's perfect. So you would read the 10th for my first child, and then which house for my second child?
And then your second child is ruled by your seventh house. And then you would count the fifth from the seventh for that child's future life, which would be the 11th. So that's what that child is building toward. So one of the things that second child is building toward, that child already in this life, in your chart, this is derivative houses, is already ruled by Sagittarius. But the future life for that child is going to be symbolically ruled by Aries and Mars in Scorpio. And Aries they're both fire signs, Sagittarius and Aries. Aries, however, is a cardinal sign. So it's this matter of leadership and independence and self-expression. That child, your second one, is building toward a future life where they will be more independent, even much more than they are in this life, and probably more headstrong as well. You see what I mean? So you can separate the two children in your natal chart and then look to their past lives in your natal chart or their future lives in your natal chart and begin to get an idea of what archetypes they're growing into and will develop even further in this next life.
Yes, that's excellent. And I would very much encourage people to go back to our previous early episodes, because we laid a lot of groundwork of how Robert does astrology. And we were noticing that not a lot of people who have listened, obviously, to the later episodes go all the way back. And if you'd like a log of those, we have a log that's available for free. It's a PDF download at funastrology.com, and it will give you the titles of all of those early episodes so you can target what you want to go listen to. But Robert went through a technique of this whole thing about where the first child is in a male's chart, where the first child is in a female chart. It's all there. So please go back for that. Robert, there's one other question that I know probably a lot of people are screaming at their phone or whatever they're listening on right now is, what about mom and dad? So I'm asking as my kid's dad, Well, what about their mom? What influence does that have? Is it a blend of both charts? Because I believe we choose our parents, but we don't know. Does that also apply to their mother's natal chart?
Yes, and it's very interesting, Thomas, because if you're talking about your children collectively, that's your fifth house. Their future life is ruled by the fifth from the fifth, which is Aquarius. And we talked about that last week. And so the whole archetypes of Aquarius and so on, ruled by both Saturn and Uranus, you could read what they're building toward in their fifth life. If you wanted to know their mother's influence on their future life, you would look at her horoscope and do the same thing. Her children would be shown collectively in the fifth house, and their future would be shown in the fifth from her fifth, which again is the ninth house. And you'll get different influences from you and your wife or your ex-wife in terms of unconsciously guiding them toward a future life. It's not that it's fatalistic. It's what kind of traits will the children pick up from the father, which in this chart is you, as a sort of basis for their future incarnation. And in this case, it's Aquarian. Your wife, do you remember what she had on the first house?
No, and I don't have her birth time.
Okay, well, anyway, she'll have a different chart. Her fifth house will still rule her children collectively, and she will have a different sign on her ninth house, which is their fifth of the future life. And that will give you clues as to how she has influenced where they're going after they leave this life and enter a new one.
That's excellent, because I'm sure a lot of the I would imagine that most of our audience is female, and I would imagine that most of our audience are parents, and I'm sure that they are anxious to dig into this.
You know, I wanted to just take this one step further because each child will pick up different influences. So if you can separate the children out, in a man's chart, your first child, which is your son, is ruled by your fifth house. Your second child, which is the daughter, is ruled by your seventh house. So each one of those will have a different fifth house. Your son will have an Aquarian influence because that's the fifth from his fifth. And this is what he gets from you. Your daughter will have an Aries fifth house from her first house. And that Aries quality will be the kind of life that she will be headed for as a result of your influence in her life. See what I mean?
Yes, and one of our comments on YouTube was great. Somebody said, "This is so gold." Like, this is pure gold. But they said it's also intimidating. And I get that. And folks, this is why I say go back and listen to the early episode where Robert went through. It's the episode that talks about how to rectify a chart based on your children's birth order. That's the episode where he goes through all of this. Because what he just described in my chart, for a male, for the father, you start with the fifth house. And for the woman, for the mother, you start with the fourth house. So you have to combine all of this. And this isn't a class. This is a podcast. So we can't granularize it that deeply. But we really did cover it. You'll understand it if you go back to the beginning and listen to that prior early episode. I think it might have been the third one. But without going back there and looking, it's also on that show log. It's the one about rectification, which is a good technique for you to know anyway, too. All right, so there's one other question that I'd like to put on the table to kind of button this up, and that is, all right, so let's go back to just the collective now. We're talking about the collective children represented in both mom and dad's fifth house. The fifth house rules children. So the collective children and the fifth from the fifth, the ninth house in an individual's chart, whether it's mom or dad, represents some of the characteristics of their future. What if one of the parents and the child or one of their children has either their sun or their moon as their birth sign being the same sign as on the cusp of that ninth house? So in other words, if one of my kids was an Aquarian, what kind of difference would that make?
I don't know it'd make a difference other than a difference in emphasis. If their sun is, let's say, an Aquarius, then that child would respond in a solar way, namely a life force way, to your Aquarian influence on both children, because children collectively are ruled by your fifth house, and their collective future lives ruled by the fifth from the fifth in your chart, which is Aquarius. So if they happen to have an Aquarian sun, then the very center of their being, their life, will respond very directly and powerfully to that part of the influence. For example, if you look at your fifth house, Thomas, the Mars in tune that you have there, Mars, Neptune, Sun, that's an influence on both of your children. Your son, S-O-N, is your first child, and he's ruled by that house. He will be the one to respond most powerfully and directly to your Mars in tune conjunction there. Now, you'll still have a Mars in tune influence on your second child, but she, ruled at your seventh house, will respond in a Saturn in Capricorn way to your same Mars in tune influence.
You know, there is so much richness in what you're teaching here. And I know, folks, I know this is complicated. I know it is. You're going to have to go back and parse this out. And obviously, you can get a reading. If you wanted to do this for your family, book a reading with Robert, and he'll walk through all of it with you. And it probably, I mean, if you wanted to do this, it probably would take up most of a session. Just plan on that. Like, it's not part of a reading. This is a reading, a full couple of hours of very intense explanation so that you can understand it. But, Robert, I got to throw another variable in here. So what you were just saying is, for my second child, that would be the seventh house. What if there was a third child? And I'm throwing you this hook because that lands us back on the ninth house, which you were saying we can go to the next sign. So if we were looking at this from that perspective and I had 3 kids, where would we read the third child?
Third child would be the ninth house, and that child would have been directly connected with you in your past life. Directly.
Because
their sun is in your ninth house.
Now we've got a lot of ears that just perked up. Okay, explain.
All right, simply because in a man's chart, you start with his first child ruled by the odd numbered house. The first child in a male's chart is the fifth house. The second child in a male's chart is a sibling to the first, so that's in the third from the fifth or the seventh house. A man's third child is ruled by his ninth house, which happens to rule your past life in the ascendant triad. He is, or she, but it would probably be a he, is the only one of the 3 children whose sun falls in your ninth house. And therefore, that child, the third child, shown in your ninth house in a man's chart, would directly connect to your past life, which directly connects to this life in the ascendant triad.
Yeah.
You see how I mean, so the richness involved in these natal charts is really astonishing.
All right. Now, look, probably about 70 or 80% of our audience is female. So we have to take care of our moms here. So we have to do this. We have to do this for the 4th, just so they understand. So the same thing. Now, what he was just telling you, you start with my 5th house because I'm the dad. But mom is represented first child in the 4th house. And we're not going to land on the 9th house. So walk us around with 3 or 4 kids from mom.
All right, in a woman's chart, even if she's had a miscarriage or an abortion and she goes on to have children, her first living child is shown at her 4th house. And that child's future life is shown at the 5th house from the 4th. So that would be the 8th house. Her second child is shown in a woman's chart at her 6th house. The sibling third from the 4th house of her first child. So her second child is shown at the 6th. That child's future life is shown at the 5th from the 6th, which is the 10th house in her chart. And a third child in a woman's chart is shown at her 8th house. And that child's 5th house of the future life is shown at the 11th. So you can absolutely begin to read themes and archetypes about where each child is headed in his or her own development in this life toward what they will emphasize in a future life. So you can help them consciously be aware of these themes and archetypes that are awaiting them in a future life so that they can consciously develop them in this life to capitalize on in their next life.
So because for the mom, we skip over the ninth house, does that mean they don't have that same kind of connection that the dad would?
Yes. Mothers and fathers' influence on the children are completely different. They may be harmonious, but they are not the same. And it's far deeper than saying, oh, well, women are always daddy's little girls and the little boys are always mama's little boy. And that may or may not be true, but yeah, absolutely. And of course, if you want to look at your own chart at the various, how you relate to both your mother and your father, then in your chart, your father's relationship with you and how you respond to him and how he influences you starts with your fourth house of the father. And your mother's influence on you, whether you're a man or a woman, your mother's influence on you is at your 10th house. So it's fascinating to consider those in your own natal chart. It's interesting to me that you have your north node, for example, Thomas, in your fourth house of the father, and your south node in your 10th house of the mother. So you might want, it'll give you a lot to ruminate about, because you happen to have the moon's nodes, which is a karmic axis. The nodes are related to the moon, which rules your past. It rules your family. The moon rules your ancestors. The nodes, and I'm writing a book about this now, the moon's nodes are directly connected forever with the moon itself. So the nodes very specifically, as many old authorities, which I quote in this book, going back to William Lilly and beyond, about the influence of the north node and the south node, those are that axis in everybody's chart is very karmic. So your two parents, because this nodal axis emphasizes your fourth, 10th axis, your parents have a strong karmic influence on you. Now, mine is in a different set of houses. My nodal axis is in my first and seventh, which frankly is at odds with both parents because the first and seventh axis squares the fourth, 10th. And I'm very unlike both of my parents and was in conflict with them. Not that they were very loving, but nonetheless, what I've done with my life has zero to do with either one of them because I looked at their lives as I grew up and realized none of this is me. So I have a choice here. I have the nodes in the first, seventh axis. Do I live for myself and be true to me, or do I live for the other in the seventh and try to live a life that pleases other people? So this axis of the nodes becomes really interesting to study in your chart because it's always karma.
Yeah, that's just incredible. Okay, now let me clean up a couple of questions and then we're going to slide out of here. So, first of all, you have to, if you're going to do this and you want to look at mom and dad's, like I don't know my kid's mom's birth time. I wasn't doing astrology back then. So I can't put her chart up to see this influence. You can't do this with a solar chart, for example, correct?
Yes, you could.
Oh, you could.
Yes, you could.
Oh, go into that then for a second.
The solar chart, if you don't have a time of birth, you set the chart up for the person's birth date at the location where they were born, and you set the chart up for noon because that will give you the moon's position at noon. Now, the moon can vary from noon that day, 6 degrees either way. It moves 1 degree every 2 hours. But you set the chart up for noon. This is what you do with an unknown birth time. And then take that noon chart and turn it so the sun is on the first cusp. And that's called a solar chart. I teach students, yes, you have a timed birth chart. Take that chart and turn it so the sun is on the first house. You've got your own solar chart and read it too, because it is just as valid. It's not necessarily as specific in some ways, but it's absolutely valid.
So get what you can from it, in other words.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. That takes care of that. Now, another question that I'm thinking people are probably asking. You mentioned, and then kind of we went on, but miscarriages and abortions. How do you handle that related to, okay, let's do two scenarios. So a woman has a miscarriage or an abortion. Is that child considered the fourth house child for that woman?
No.
All right. What if
the fourth house is the first living child in a woman's chart.
So then she has a child, and then let's say she has a miscarriage. Does that child appear in the sixth house?
Nope.
All right. So it's only living born children.
Yep.
All right. Excellent. Robert, this is amazing. I'll tell you what let's do from here. Let's leave it to our audience to ask questions, and you and I are either going to have to do a string of other podcasts on this, or we're going to have to do a course on this, okay? So if you have a question, the best way to submit it, two ways you can do it. They're both on funastrology.com. One is in the upper left. The orange button allows you to record your voice and send us the question in your own voice. It cuts off after 90 seconds, so be concise with it. And you don't even have to include an email. It's open. We just want your questions on that. Or go diagonally down to the lower right, and there's a chat bot there. If you'd rather leave an email, you can do it there, and we'll answer either from both sources. We would love to hear what your thoughts are on this and questions. So thank you so much, Robert, for great stuff, for all of you for hanging in with us on these two, as somebody said, intimidating episodes. We know this is deep, but it just shows you the richness, not only of the chart, but also the teacher, because you don't get this stuff in a lot of other places. So we're so thrilled, Robert and I both together, that we can bring this to you. Thanks for listening. We'll see you in the next episode.